halfway up the gangplank, his newly acquired crew readying themselves to set sail. "Haven't I heard that Nassau is crawling with pirates?" he laughed. "Seems a very tawdry place." I thought of it. I thought of Nassau. "No, not tawdry," I told him. "Liberated." He smiled. "Oh, God, that would be an adventure." "But no, I'm a husband and a father. I have responsibilities. Life can't be all pleasure and distraction, Duncan." For a moment I'd forgotten my assumed identity and felt the tremor of guilt. Bonnet had done nothing but help me. Quite what had possessed me I wasn't sure. Guilt, I suppose. But I told him. "Hey, Bonnet. The name's Edward, in truth. Duncan is only a handle." "Ah," he smiled. "A secret name for your secret meeting with the governor." "Yes, the governor," I said. "Right, I think I've kept him waiting long enough." 27. I went straight to Governor Torres's residence, a vast mansion set behind steep walls and metal gates, well away from Havana's hubbub. There I told the sentries, "Good afternoon, Mr. Duncan Walpole of England to see the governor. I believe he is expecting me." "Yes, Mr. Walpole. Please enter." That was easy. The gates squeaked, a hot summer's day sound, and I stepped through to be awarded with my first glance of how the other half lived. Everywhere were palm trees and short statues on plinths, and from somewhere the sound of running water, a marked contrast to the fortress, opulent where that had been grimy, gaudy where that had been forbidding. As we walked, the two sentries stayed a respectful but still watchful distance behind, and my limited Spanish picked up fragments of their gossip. Apparently I was a couple of days late. Apparently I was an asesino, an assassin. There was something about the way they said the word that was odd, the way they stressed it. I kept my shoulders back, chin held high, thinking only that I needed to continue the subterfuge for a short while longer. I'd enjoyed being Duncan Walpole. It had felt liberating to leave Edward Kenway behind, and there were times I'd considered saying goodbye for good. Certainly there were parts of Duncan I wanted to keep, souvenirs, keepsakes. His robes, for one, his fighting style, his bearing. Right now, though, what I wanted most was his reward. We came into a courtyard, which was vaguely reminiscent of the fortress, except while that was a stony drill square overlooked by shadowed walkways, this was an oasis of sculpture, lush-leaved plants, and the ornate galleries of the Palacio framing a sky of deep blue and a sun that smouldered in the distance. There were two men already there, both well-dressed, men of class and distinction, I could tell. More difficult to fool. Close by them was a rack of weapons. One of them stood aiming a pistol at a target, the other cleaning another pistol. At the sound of myself and the sentries entering the courtyard, the shooter looked over, annoyed at the interruption, and then with a little shake of his shoulders composed himself, squinted along the line of the pistol, and squeezed off a shot. The sound rang around the courtyard. Applause came from startled birds. A tiny wisp of smoke rose from the dead centre of the target, which had rocked slightly on its tripod. The shooter looked to his companion with a wry smile, received an impressed eyebrow raise in return. This the vocabulary of the well-to-do. And then they turned their attention to me. "You're Duncan Walpole," I told myself, and tried not to wilt beneath their scrutiny. "You're Duncan Walpole, a man of danger, an equal, here at the invitation of the governor." "Good afternoon, sir." The man who'd been cleaning the gun smiled broadly. He had long greying hair tied back, and a face that had spent many an hour in the sea breeze. Would I be correct in thinking you are Duncan Walpole? Remembering how Walpole had spoken, cultured tones. I am indeed, I replied, and I sounded so phony to my own ears that I half expected the gun cleaner to point his pistol straight at me and order the guards to arrest me on the spot. Instead, he said, I thought as much, and still beaming, strode across the courtyard to offer me a hand that was as hard as oak. Woodes Rogers. A pleasure. Woodes Rogers. I'd heard of him, and the pirate in me paled because Woodes Rogers was the scourge of my kind. A former privateer, he'd since declared a hatred of those who turned to piracy, and pledged to lead expeditions aimed at rooting them out. Pirates such as Edward Kenway he'd like to see hanged. But you're Duncan Walpole, I told myself, and met his eye as I shook his hand firmly. Not a pirate. Oh no, perish the thought. An equal. Here at the invitation of the governor. The thought, comforting as it had been, faded in my mind as I realized that he'd fixed me with a curious gaze. At the same time he wore a quizzical half-smile, as though he'd had a thought and wasn't sure whether to let it go free. I must say my wife has a terrible eye for description, he said, evidently letting his curiosity get the better of him. I'm sorry? My wife. You met her some years ago at the Percy's masquerade ball. Ah, quite. She called you devilishly handsome. Obviously a lie to stoke my jealousy. I laughed as though in on the joke. Should I be offended he didn't think me devilishly handsome? Or just pleased the conversation had moved on? Eyes on his gun, I plumped for the latter. Now I was being introduced to the second man, a dark Frenchman with a guarded look called Julien de Casse, who was calling me the guest of honour and talking about some order I was supposed to join. Again I was referred to as an assassin. Again it was with an odd emphasis I couldn't quite decode. Assassino. Assassin. Assassin. He was querying the honesty of my conversion to the order, and my mind returned to the wording of Walpole's letter. Your support for our secret and most noble cause is warming. What secret and noble cause would that be then, I wondered. I have not come to disappoint, I said, uncertainly. Tell the truth, I didn't have the foggiest what he was on about. What I wanted was to give the satchel with one hand and receive a bulging bag of gold with the other. Failing that, I wanted to move on, because right now I felt as though my deception was likely to crumble at any second. In the end it was a relief when Woodes Rogers' face broke into a grin. The same grin he no doubt grinned at the thought of pirates' heads in hangmen's nooses, and he clapped me on the back and insisted I take part in the shooting. Happy to oblige, anything to take their minds off me, I engaged them in conversation at the same time. How is your wife these days, Captain Rogers? Is she here in Havana? I held my breath, steeling myself against his next words. Yes, here she is right now. Darling, you remember Duncan Walpole, don't you? Instead, he said, Oh, no, no, we've been separated these 2 years past. Sorry to hear that, I said, thinking what excellent news it was. I trust she is well, he went on, a touch of wistfulness in his voice that sparked a brief thought of my own lost love. But I wouldn't know. I've been in Madagascar some 14 months hunting pirates. So I had heard. You mean Libertalia, the pirate town? That was Libertalia in Madagascar. According to legend, Captain William Kidd had stopped there in 1697 and ended up leaving with only half his crew, the rest of them seduced by the lifestyle of a pirate utopia, where the motto was, "For God and Liberty," with the emphasis on liberty, where they spared the lives of prisoners, kept killing to a minimum, shared all the spoils fairly, no matter your rank or standing. It sounded too good to be true, and there were plenty who thought it was a mythical place, but I'd been assured it existed. Rogers was laughing. What I saw in Madagascar was little more than the aftermath of a sad orgy. A ruffian squat. Even the feral dog seemed ashamed of its condition. As for the 20 or 30 men living there, I cannot say they were ragged, since most wore no clothes at all. They had gone native, as the saying goes. I thought of Nassau, where such low standards wouldn't be tolerated. Not before nightfall, at least. "And how did you deal with their kind?" I asked, a picture of innocence. "Very simply. Most pirates are as ignorant as apes. I merely offered them a choice. Take a pardon and return to England, penniless but free men, or be hanged by the neck until dead. It took some work to dislodge the criminals there, but we managed it. In future I hope to use the same tactics throughout the West Indies." "Ah," I said, "I imagine Nassau will be your next target." "Very astute, Duncan. Indeed. Point of fact, the moment I return to England I intend to petition King George with the hope of becoming his emissary in the Bahamas. As governor, no less." So that was it. Nassau was the next step. The place I'd come to think of as my spiritual home was under threat, from the carriage gun, the musket ball, or maybe just the scratch of a quill. But under threat all the same. I managed to distinguish myself in the shooting and was feeling pretty pleased with myself, all told. So once again my thoughts returned to the reward. As soon as I had my money I could return to Nassau, and once there warn Edward and Benjamin that the infamous Woodes Rogers had a Bahamas-shaped bee in his bonnet for our little pirate republic, that he was coming for us. And then a box was opened, and I heard Rogers say, "Wonderful. You're a crack shot, Duncan. As good with a pistol as with your wrist blade, I imagine." Wrist blade, I thought distantly. Wrist blade? If only he had one, Ducasse was saying as I peered at several sets of hidden blades displayed in the box. Blades like the one I had reluctantly discarded on the beach at Cape Buena Vista. "Duncan, where is your wrist blade? I have never seen an assassin so ill-equipped." Again, assassin, as in assassin. "Ah, damaged, sadly, beyond repair," I replied. Ducasse indicated the selection in the box. "Then have your choice," he purred. And was it his thick French accent, or did he mean to make it sound more like a threat than an offer? I wondered where the blades were from. Other assassins, of course. But assassins or assassins? Walpole had been one, but had been meaning to convert. A traitor. But what was this order which he'd been planning to join? "These are souvenirs," Julian was saying. Dead men's blades. I reached into the box and drew one out. The blade shone and its fixings trailed against my arm. At which point it dawned on me. They wanted me to use it. They wanted to see me in action. Whether as a test or for sport, it didn't matter. Either way, they wanted a display of proficiency in a weapon I'd never used before. Immediately, I went up from congratulating myself on having discarded the bloody thing, it would have given me away, to cursing myself for not having kept it. I could have practised and been competent with it by now. I squared my shoulders in Duncan Walpole's robes. An imposter. Now I had to be him. I had to really be him. They watched as I strapped on the blade. A weak joke about being out of practice elicited polite but humourless chuckles. With it on, I let my sleeve drop down over my hand, and as we walked began to flex my fingers, adjusting my wrist and feeling for the telltale catch of the blade engaging. Walpole's blade had been wet that day we fought. Who knows, perhaps it really had been damaged. This one, greased and shined, would surely be more cooperative. I prayed it would be. Imagined the looks on their faces if I simply failed to make it work. Are you sure you are who you say you are? Guards! Instinctively I found myself seeking out the nearest escape route. And not only that, but wishing I'd just left the bloody satchel of documents where I'd found it, wishing I'd left Walpole well alone. What was wrong with life as Edward Kenway anyway? I was poor, but at least I was alive. I could have been back in Nassau right now, planning raids with Edward and eyeing up Anne Bonny at the Old Avery. Edward had warned me not to join Captain Brahma. From the moment I'd suggested it, he told me Brahma was bad news. Why didn't I bloody listen? The voice of Julian Ducasse interrupted my thoughts. Duncan, he pronounced it Durnkern. Would you indulge us with a demonstration of your techniques? I was being tested. Every question, every challenge they threw my way, it was all an attempt to force me to prove my mettle. So far I'd passed. Not with flying colours, but I'd passed. But now we'd stepped outside the confines of the courtyard, and I was greeted with what looked like a newly constructed practice area. Tall palms lining either side of a grassed avenue, with targets at one end, and just beyond that what looked like an ornamental lake, shimmering like a plateful of blue sunshine. Behind the tree line, shadows moved among the scaly trunks of the palm trees. More guards in case I made a break for it. We put together a small training course in anticipation of your arrival, said Rogers. I swallowed. My host stood to one side, expectant. Rogers still carried the pistol, held loosely in one hand, but his finger was on the trigger, and Julian rested his right palm on the hilt of his sword. Behind the trees, the figures of the guards stood motionless, waiting. Even the chirruping of insects and birds seemed to drop away. It would be a shame to leave here without seeing you in action. Woods Rogers smiled, but his eyes were cold. And just my luck, the only weapon I had I couldn't bloody use. Doesn't matter. I can take them anyway. To the old Bristolian scrapper in me, they were just another pair of leery twats outside a tavern. I thought of how I'd watched Walpole fight, with perfect awareness of his surroundings, how we could lay these two out and then be upon the nearest guards before they had a chance to even raise their muskets. Yes, I could do that. Catch them unawares. Now was the time, I thought. Now. I braced and drew back my arm to throw the first punch. And the blade engaged. 28. Oh, well done, Duncan, said Rogers, clapping, and I looked from him and Ducasse to my shadow cast on the grass. I'd struck quite a pose with the blade engaged. What's more, I thought I knew how I had done it. A tensing of muscle that came as much from the upper arm as the forearm. Very impressive, said Ducasse. He stepped forward, held my arm with one hand that he used to release a catch, and then very carefully used the flat of his other palm to ease the blade back into its housing. Now, let's see you do it again. Without taking my eyes off him, I took a step back and assumed the same position. This time there was no luck involved, and even though I didn't know quite what I was doing, I had perfect confidence it would work. Don't ask me how I knew. I just did. Sure enough, Snick. The blade sprang from the support and glinted evilly in the afternoon sun. A little noisy, I smiled, getting cocky now. Ideally, you'd not hear a thing, otherwise it's fine. Their challenges were interminable, but by the end I felt I was performing for the pleasure rather than their reassurance. Any tests were over. The guards had drifted away, and even Ducasse, who wore his wariness like a favoured old frock coat, seemed to have relaxed. By the time we left the makeshift training area, he was talking to me like an old friend. "The assassins have trained you well, Duncan," he said. The assassins, I thought. So that's what this group were called. Walpole had been a member, but intended to betray his brothers, low-down scum-sucker that he obviously was. Betray them for what, is the question. You chose the perfect time to leave them behind. At great risk, enthused Rogers. Betraying the assassins is never good for one's health. Well, I said, somewhat pompously, neither is drinking liquor, but I am drawn to its dangers all the same. He chuckled as I turned my attention to Ducasse. And, what is your business here, sir? Are you an associate of the governor's, or an impending acquaintance, like me? I am, how do you say, a weapons dealer. I deal in pilfered guns and armaments. A smuggler of sorts, piped up Rogers. Guns, blades, granados, anything that may kill a man, I am happy to provide, clarified the Frenchman. By now we had reached the terrace, where I first clapped eyes on Governor Torres. He was about 70 years old, but not fat the way rich men get. Apart from a clipped goatee beard, his face was brown and lined and topped with brushed forward thinning white hair, and with one hand on the bowl of a long-stemmed pipe, he peered through round spectacles at correspondence he held in his other hand. He didn't look up, not at first. All the looking was taken care of by the big bearded man who stood patiently at his right shoulder, his arms folded, as still as one of the courtyard statues, and 10 times as stony. I recognized him at once, of course. The previous day I'd seen him send 3 pirates to their death. Why, that very morning I'd pretended to procure prostitutes in his name. It was the Spaniard, El Tiburon, and although by now I should have been accustomed to intense examination by my hosts, his eyes seemed to drill right through me. For a while, as his stare bore into me, I was absolutely certain that not only had he spoken to the guards at the Castillo, but that they had given him my detailed description, and that any second now he would raise a trembling finger, point at me, and demand to know why I'd been at the fortress. Grand Master Torres. It was Rogers who broke the silence. Mr. Duncan Walpole has arrived. Torres looked up and regarded me over the top of his spectacles. He nodded, then handed his letter to El Tiburon, and thank God he did, for it meant that at last El Tiburon tore his eyes away from me. You were expected 1 week ago, said Torres, but without much irritation. Apologies, Governor, I replied. My ship was set upon by pirates and we were scuttled. I arrived only yesterday. He nodded thoughtfully. Unfortunate. But were you able to salvage from these pirates the items you promised me? I nodded, thinking, one hand to give you the satchel, the other hand to take the money. And from my robes I took the bag and dropped it on a low table by Torres's knees. He puffed on his pipe, then opened the satchel and took out the maps. I'd seen the maps before, of course, and they didn't mean anything to me, nor did the crystal for that matter, but they meant something to Torres, all right. No doubt about it. Incredible, he said in tones of wonderment. The assassins have more resources than I had imagined. And now he reached for the crystal, squinting at it through his spectacles and turning it over in his fingers. This ornament, or whatever it was, well, to him it was no ornament. He placed the papers and crystal back into the satchel and crooked a hand for El Tiburon, who stepped forward and took the satchel. With that, Torres reached for my hand to shake, pumping it vigorously as he spoke. "It is a pleasure to meet you at last, Duncan," he said. "You are most welcome. Come, gentlemen," he motioned to the others. "We have much to discuss. Come." We began to move away from the terrace, all friends together. Still no word about the bloody reward. Shit. I was getting deeper and deeper into something I wanted no part of. 29. We stood around a large table in a private room inside the main building. Me, Torres, El Tiburon, Ducasse, and Rogers. El Tiburon, who remained at his master's shoulder, held a long, thin box, like a cigar box. Did I imagine it, though, or were his eyes constantly on me? Had he somehow seen through me, or been alerted? "Sir, a strange man in robes was looking for you at the fortress earlier." I didn't think so, though. Apart from him, everybody else in the room seemed relaxed, accepting drinks from Torres and chatting amiably while he made his own. Like any good host, he'd ensured his guests were holding full glasses first, but I wondered why he didn't have staff to serve them. And then thought I knew the answer. It was the nature of our business in this room. The atmosphere might well have been relaxed, at least it was for the time being, but Torres had been sure to post a sentry, then close the door with a gesture that seemed to say, "Anything said in this room is for our ears only." The kind of gesture that was making me feel less reassured with each passing moment, wishing I'd taken note of the line in the letter about my support for their secret and most noble cause. I must remember that next time I'm considering becoming an impostor, I thought. Give noble causes a wide berth, especially if they're secret noble causes. But now we all had our drinks, so a toast was raised, Torres saying, "Convened at last, and in such continental company, England, France, Spain, citizens of sad and corrupted empires." At a wave from Torres, El Tiburon moved across, opened the box he held and placed it on the table. I saw red velvet lining and the gleam of metal from inside. Whatever it was, it looked significant, and indeed it proved as Torres, his smile fading, the natural gleam of his eyes replaced by something altogether more serious, began what was obviously a ceremony of some importance. "But you are Templars now," he was saying, "the secret and true legislators of the world. Please hold out your hands." The convivial atmosphere was suddenly solemn. Drinks were set down. I shuffled quickly to my side, seeing that the others had placed themselves at intervals around the table. Next I did as I was asked and proffered my hand, thinking, Templars. Now that's what they were. And it seems odd to say now, but I relaxed. I relaxed in the belief that they were nothing more sinister than a secret society. A silly club like any other silly club, full of deluded, pompous fools, whose grandiose aims, the secret and true legislators of the world no less, were hot air. Just an excuse for bickering about meaningless titles and trinkets. What were their petty concerns, I wondered, and found I didn't care. After all, why would I? As a pirate, I'd renounced all law but pirate law. My freedom, absolute. I was governed by rules, of course I was, but they were the rules of the sea, and adhering to them was a matter of need, for survival, rather than the acquisition of status and the peacocking of sashes and baubles. What were their squabbles with the assassins, I wondered, and found I couldn't give a fig about that either. So yes, I relaxed. I didn't take them seriously. Torres placed the first ring on Ducas's finger. "Mark and remember our purpose, to guide all wayward souls till they reach a quiet road." A second ring was placed on Roger's finger. "To guide all wayward desire till impassioned hearts are cooled." Hot air, I thought. Nothing but empty, meaningless statements. No purpose other than to award their speaker unearned authority. Look at them all, lapping it up like it meant something. Silly men so deluded by a sense of their own importance that they were unable to see that it extended no further than the walls of the mansion. Nobody cares, my friends. Nobody cares about your secret society. Now Torres was addressing me, and he placed on my finger a third ring, saying, "To guide all wayward minds to safe and sober thought." Sober, I thought. That was a laugh. And then I looked down at the ring he'd put on my finger, and suddenly I was no longer amused. Suddenly I was no longer thinking of these Templars as a silly secret society with no influence outside their own homes, because on my finger was the same ring as worn by the East India Company's ship captain, Benjamin Pritchard, the same ring worn by the man in the hood, the leader of the group who had burned my father's farmhouse, both of whom had warned me of great and terrible powers at work. And suddenly I was thinking that whatever squabbles these people had with the assassins, then, well, I was on the side of the assassins. For now, I would bide my time. Torres stood back. "By the Father of Understanding's light, let our work now begin," he said. "Decades ago, the Council entrusted me with the task of locating in the West Indies a forgotten place our precursors once called the Observatory. See here." On the table before him were spread out the documents from the satchel, placed there by El Tiburon. "Look upon these images and commit them to memory," added Torres. "They tell a very old and important story. For 2 decades now I have endeavored to locate this observatory. The place is rumored to contain a tool of incredible utility and power. It houses a kind of armillary sphere, if you like. A device that would grant us the power to locate and monitor every man and woman on Earth, whatever their location. Only imagine what it would mean to have such power. With this device there would be no secrets among men, no lies, no trickery, only justice. Pure justice. This is the observatory's promise, and we must take it for our own." So that, then, was when I first learnt of the observatory. "Do we know its whereabouts?" asked Rogers. "We will soon," replied Torres, "for in our custody is the one man who does. A man named Roberts, once called a sage." Ducasse gave a small, scoffing laugh. "It has been 45 years since anyone has seen an actual sage. Can you be sure this one is authentic?" "We are confident he is," replied Torres. "The assassins will come for him," said Rogers. I looked at the documents spread out before us, drawings of what looked like an ancient race of people building something. The observatory, presumably. Slaves breaking rocks and carrying huge stone blocks. They looked human, but not quite human. One thing I did know, a plan was beginning to form. This observatory, which meant so much to the Templars, what would it be worth? More to the point, what would it be worth to a man planning revenge on the people who had helped torch his childhood home? The small crystal cube was still on the table. I puzzled over it, just as I had on the beach at Cape Buena Vista, Now I watched as Torres reached and picked it up, replying to Rogers at the same time. "Indeed, the assassins will come for us, but, thanks to Duncan and the information he has delivered, the assassins won't be a problem for much longer. All will be made clear tomorrow, gentlemen, when you meet the sage for yourselves. Until then, let us drink." Our host indicated a drinks table, and while backs were turned, I reached to the documents and pocketed a page of manuscript, a picture of the observatory. Just in time. Torres turned, handing glasses to the men. "Let us find the observatory together, for with its power, kings will fall, clergy will cower, and the hearts and minds of the world will be ours." We drank. We drank together, though I know for sure we drank in honour of very different things indeed. 30. The next day I'd been asked to meet my fellow Templars at the city's northern ports, where it was said the treasure fleet would be arriving with my reward, and we could discuss further schemes. I nodded, keen to give the impression that I was an eager Templar, plotting with my new firm friends to do whatever it was that Templars plot to do, a small matter of being able to influence every man and woman on earth. In fact, what I intended to do, just between me and you, was pocket the money, make my excuses, whatever those excuses needed to be, and leave. I was looking forward to spending my money and sharing my newfound information with my confederates at Nassau, then finding the observatory, reaping the rewards, helping the downfall of these Templars. But first I had to collect my money. "Good morning, Duncan." I heard Woodes Rogers hailing me from the docks. It was a fresh morning in Havana, the sun yet to reach full temperature and a light breeze blowing in from the Gulf of Mexico. I began following Rogers. Then I heard a voice shout, "Edward! Hello, Edward!" For a second or so I thought it was a case of mistaken identity, even found myself looking over my shoulder to see this Edward, until I remembered. Edward was me. I was Edward. Stupid Edward, who from a misplaced sense of guilt had admitted my secret to Havana's biggest blabbermouth, Stede Bonnet. "I'd found a man to purchase my remaining sugar. Quite a coup, I must say," he called across the harbour. I waved back, "Excellent news," aware of Roger's eyes upon me. "He just called you Edward," said my companion. That same curious smile I'd seen yesterday played about his lips again. "Oh, that's the merchant who sailed me here," I explained, with a conspiratorial wink. Out of caution, I gave him a false name. "Ah, well done," said Rogers, but not convinced. I was thankful to leave the main harbour behind when Rogers and I joined the same group of Templars who'd met at Torres's mansion the day before. Hands were shaken, the rings of our brotherhood, still fresh on our fingers, glinted, and we gave each other short nods. Brothers. Brothers in a secret society. And then Torres led us to a line of small fishermen's huts, with rowing boats tethered in the water nearby. There was no one about, not yet. We had this small area of the harbour to ourselves, which was the intention, no doubt, as Torres guided us to the end, where guards waited at a small hut, and inside, sitting on an upturned crate, with a beard and ragged clothes, in his eyes a dejected but defiant look, was the sage. I watched the faces of my companions change. Just as the conflict between defeat and belligerence seemed to play out on the face of the sage, so the Templars appeared to struggle too, and they returned his glare with a look that was a mix of pity and awe. "Here he is," said Torres, speaking quietly, almost reverently, whether he knew it or not. "A man both Templars and assassins have sought for over a decade." He addressed the sage, I am told your name is Bartholomew Roberts. Is this so? Robert, or the sage, or whatever we were calling him today, said nothing, merely stared balefully at Torres. Without taking his eyes off the sage, Torres opened a hand at shoulder level. Into his palm, El Tiburon placed the crystal cube. The same crystal cube I'd wondered about. I was going to find out what it was now. Torres, speaking to the sage again, said, "You recognize this, I think." Silence from Bartholomew Roberts. The sage was saying nothing. Perhaps he knew what was coming next. For now Torres indicated again, and a second upturned crate was brought to him, onto which he sat so that he faced the sage, man to man, except that one of the men was governor of Havana, and the other man was ragged and had wild hermit eyes, and his hands were bound. It was to those bound hands that Torres reached, bringing the crystal cube to bear, and then inserting it over the sage's thumb. The two men stared at each other for a moment or so. Torres's fingers seemed to be manipulating the sage's thumb somehow, before a single droplet of blood filled the vial. I watched, not quite sure what I was witnessing. The sage seemed to feel no pain, and yet his eyes went from one man to the next, as though cursing each of us in turn, me included, and he fixed me with a stare of such ferocity that I found myself having to resist the impulse to shrink away. Why on earth did they need this poor man's blood? What did it have to do with the observatory? According to the old tales, the blood of a sage is required to enter the observatory, said Ducasse in a whisper, as though reading my thoughts. The operation was over, and Torres stood up from his crate, a little shaky, with one hand holding the vial for all to see. Caught by the light, the blood-filled crystal gave his hand a red glow. "We have the key," he announced. "Now we need only its location. Perhaps Mr. Roberts will be eager to provide it." He waved guards forward. "Transfer him to my residence." And that was it. The ghastly procedure was over, and I was pleased to leave the strange scene behind as we began making our way back to the main harbour, where a vessel had arrived. The one containing the treasure, I hoped. I sorely hoped. "Such a fuss over one man," I said to Torres as we walked, trying to sound more casual than I felt. "Is the observatory really such a grand prize?" "Yes, indeed," replied Torres. "The observatory was a tool built by the precursor race. Its worth is without measure." I thought of the ancients I had seen in the pictures at the mansion. Torres's precursor race? "I do wish I could remain to see our drama done," said Rogers, "but I must avail myself of these winds and sail for England." Torres nodded. That familiar twinkle had returned to his eyes. "By all means, Captain. A speed and fortune to you." The two men shook hands. Brothers. Brothers in a secret society. And then Rogers and I did the same, before the legendary pirate hunter turned and left, off to continue being the scourge of buccaneers everywhere. We would meet again, I knew, though I hoped the day would come later rather than sooner. By now one of the ship's deckhands had arrived and handed Torres something that looked suspiciously like it might contain my money. Not that the bag seemed quite as hefty as I'd hoped. "I consider this the first payment in a long-term investment," said Torres, handing me the pouch, the suspiciously light pouch. "Thank you." I took it cautiously, knowing by the weight that there was more to come, and by more to come I mean more money as well as more challenges for me to face. "I would like you to be present for the interrogation tomorrow. Call around noon," said Torres. So that was it. In order to collect the rest of my fee, I needed to see the sage terrorized further. Torres left me, and I stood there for a moment on the dock, deep in thought, before leaving to prepare. I had decided I was going to rescue the sage. And I wonder why I decided to rescue the sage. I mean, why didn't I simply take what money I'd been given, show a clean pair of heels, and fill the sails on a passage to Nassau in the northeast, back to Edward, Benjamin, and the delights of the old Avery? I'd like to say it was a noble desire to free the sage, but there was a bit more to it than that. After all, he could help find this observatory, this device to follow people around. And what would a thing like that be worth? Sell it to the right person and I would be rich. The richest pirate in the West Indies. Return to Caroline a rich man. So perhaps it was merely greed that made me decide to rescue him. Looking back, probably a mixture of the two. Either way, it was a decision I'd shortly regret. 31. Night time, and the walls of Torres's mansion formed a black border beneath a grey, starless night. The chirping insects were at their loudest, almost drowning out the trickle of running water and the soft rattle of the palm trees. With a quick look left and right, my approach had been timed to make sure no sentries were present. I flexed my fingers and jumped, pulled myself up to the top of the wall, then lay there for a second to control my breath and listen out for running feet, cries of "Hey!" and the swish of swords being drawn. And then, when there was nothing apart from the insects, the water, and the whisper of night wind among the trees, I dropped down to the other side and into the grounds of the Governor of Havana's mansion. Like a ghost, I made my way across the gardens and into the main building, where I hugged the walls along the perimeter of the courtyard. On my right forearm I felt the comforting presence of my hidden blade, and strapped across my chest were pistols. A short sword hung from my belt beneath my robes, and I wore my cowl over my head. I felt invisible. I felt lethal. I felt as though I was about to deliver a blow against the Templars, and even though, no, freeing the sage wasn't equal to the harm their brothers had done me, and it wasn't like this was going to even the score, it was a start. It was a first strike. What's more, I'd have the location of the observatory and could reach it before they did. And that was a far, far bigger blow. That would hurt. I'd think of how much it hurt while I was counting my money. I'd had to make an informed guess as to where the governor kept his state prisons, but I'm pleased to say I was right. It was a small compound, separate from the mansion, where I found a high wall and... That's odd. Why is the door hanging open? I slid through. Flaming torches bracketed on the walls illuminated a scene of carnage. 4 or 5 soldiers were dead in the dirt, gaping holes at their throats, pulverized meat at their chests. Where the sage had been kept, I had no idea. The one thing was beyond doubt. He wasn't here now. I heard a sound behind me, too late to stop the blow, but in time to prevent it knocking me out, and I pitched forward, landing badly on the dirt, but having the presence of mind to roll at the same time. A pike staff with my name on it was driven into the ground where I'd been. At the other end of it was a surprised soldier. I kicked myself up, grabbed his shoulders, and span. At the same time I booted the shaft of the pike staff and snapped it, then rammed his body onto it at the same time. He flopped like a landed fish, impaled on the broken shaft of his own pike staff, but I didn't stick around to admire his death throes. The second soldier was upon me, angry, the way you get when you see your friend die. Now, I thought, let's see if this works every time. Snick. The hidden blade engaged, and I met the steel of his blade with steel of my own, knocking his sword away and slashing open his throat with the backswipe. I drew the sword at my belt in time to meet a third attacker. Behind him were 2 soldiers with muskets. Close by was El Tiburon, his sword drawn but held at his hip as he watched the fight. I saw one of the soldiers grimace, and it was a look I recognized, a look I've seen before from men on the deck of a ship lashed to mine. He fired just as I drove both my sword and hidden blade into the soldier in front of me, pinning him with the blades and swinging him round at the same time. His body, already dead, jerked as the musket ball slammed into him. I let my human shield go, plucking a dagger from his belt as he dropped, and praying that my aim would be as good as it always had been, after countless hours at home spent tormenting tree trunks with throwing knives. It was. I took out not the first musketeer, he was already making a panicky attempt to reload, but the second, who fell with the knife embedded between his ribs. In a bound I was over to the first one and punched him in the stomach with my blade hand, so that he coughed and died on the shaft. Blood beads described an arc in the night as I pulled the blade free and span to meet the attack of El Tiburon. There was no attack, though. Instead, El Tiburon calmed the tempo of the fight, and rather than begin his attack straight away, simply stood and very casually tossed his sword from one hand to the other, before addressing me with it. Fine. At least there wouldn't be a lot of chat during this bout. I snarled and went forward, blades cutting half circles in the air, hoping to daze him, disorientate him. His expression hardly changed, and with fast movements of his elbow and forearm he met my attack easily. He was concentrating on my left hand, the hand that held the sword, and before I even realized he was doing it, my cutlass went spinning from my bloody fingers to the dirt. My blade now. He concentrated on it, seeming to know it was new to me. Behind him, more guards had gathered in the courtyard, and though I couldn't understand what they were saying, it was obvious that I was no match for El Tiburon, that my end was but a heartbeat away. And so it proved. The last of his attacks ended with a smash of the knuckle guard across my chin, and I felt teeth loosen and my head spin as I sank, first to my knees, before pitching forward. Beneath my robes, blood sluiced my sides like sweat, and what little fight was left in me was leached away by the pain. El Tiburon came forward. A boot stepped onto my blade and held my arm in place, and dimly I wondered if the blade had a quick-release buckle, even though it would do me no good, as the tip of his sword nudged my neck, ready for the final lethal strike. "Enough!" came the cry from the compound door. Squinting through a veil of blood, I saw the guards part, and Torres step through, followed closely by Ducasse. The two Templars shouldered El Tiburon aside, and with the merest flicker of irritation in his eyes, the hunter denied his kill. The enforcer stepped away. I'll be honest, I wasn't sad to see him go. I gasped ragged breath. My mouth filled with blood, and I spat as Torres and Ducasse crouched, studying me like two medical men examining a patient. When the Frenchman reached for my forearm, I half expected him to feel for my pulse, but instead he disengaged the hidden blade, unclipped it with practised fingers, then tossed it away. Torres looked at me, and I wondered if he really was as disappointed as he looked, or whether it was theatrics. He took hold of my other hand, removed my Templar ring, and pocketed it. "What is your true name, rogue?" said Torres. Disarmed as I was, they let me pull myself to a sitting position. "It's, Captain Piss Off." Again I spat, this time close to Ducasse's shoe, and he looked from the gobbet of blood to me with a sneer. "Nothing but a filthy peasant." He moved to strike me, but Torres held him back. He had been looking around the courtyard at the bodies, as though trying to assess the situation. "Where is the sage?" he asked. Then you'll set him free. I had nothing to do with that, much as I wish I did, I managed. As far as I was concerned, the sage had either been sprung by assassin friends, or staged a breakout himself. Either way, he was out of harm's way and in possession of the one secret we all wanted, the observatory location. And my trip was a wasted one. Torres looked at me and must have seen the truth in my eyes. His Templar affiliations made him my enemy, but there was something in the old man I liked, or respected at least. Perhaps he saw something in me, a sense that maybe we weren't so different. Certainly one thing I knew. If the decision had been left to Ducasse, I'd have been watching my guts drop to the compound floor. Instead, Torres stood up and signalled to his men. "Take him to the ports. Send him to Seville with the treasure fleet." "To Seville?" queried Ducasse. "Yes," replied Torres. "But we can interrogate him ourselves," said Ducasse. I heard the cruel smile in his voice. "Indeed, it would be a pleasure." "Which is exactly why I intend to entrust the job to our colleagues in Spain," said Torres firmly. "I hope this is not a problem for you, Julian." Even fogged by pain, I could hear the irritation in the Frenchman's voice. "Non, monsieur," he replied. Still, he took a great pleasure in knocking my lights out. 32. When I awoke, I was on the floor of what looked like the lower deck of a galleon. A large galleon it was, the kind that looked like it was used to transport people. My legs were gripped by iron bilboes, big, immovable manacles that were scattered all around the deck, some empty, some not. Not far away I could make out more bodies in the gloom. More men back there, at a guess maybe a dozen or so, shackled just as I was, but in what sort of shape it was difficult to tell from the low groans and mumblings that reached my ears. At the other end of the deck was piled what I took to be the captive's possessions: clothes, boots, hats, leather belts, backpacks, and chests. In among them I thought I saw my robes, still dirty and bloody from the fight in the prison compound. You remember me saying how lower decks had their own smell? Well, this one had a different smell altogether. A smell of misery. A smell of fear. A voice said, "Eat it fast," and a wooden bowl landed with a dull thump by my bare feet before the black leather boots of a guard retreated, and I saw sunlight from a hatch and heard the clip-clop of a ladder being climbed. Inside the bowl, a dry flour biscuit and a splodge of oatmeal. Not far away sat a black man, and like me, he was eyeing the food dubiously. "You hungry?" I asked him. He said nothing, made no move to reach for the food. Instead, he reached for the manacles at his feet and began to work at them, on his face an expression of profound concentration. At first I thought he was wasting his time, but as his fingers worked, sliding between his feet and the irons, his eyes went to me, and though he said nothing, I thought I saw in them the ghost of painful experience. His hands went to his mouth, and for a moment he looked like a cat cleaning itself, until the same hand dipped into the oatmeal, mixing the goo inside with saliva, and then using it to lubricate his foot in the manacle. I knew what he was doing now, and could only watch in admiration and hope as he continued to do it, making the foot more and more greasy until it was slippery enough to try. He looked at me, silenced any encouragement before it even left my lips, then twisted and pulled at the same time. He would have yelled in pain if he wasn't concentrating on keeping so quiet, and his foot, when it came free of the leg iron, was covered in a revolting mixture of blood and spit and oatmeal. But it was free, and neither of us wanted to eat the oatmeal anyway. He glanced back up the deck towards the ladder, and both of us steeled ourselves against the appearance of a guard. Then he began working at the other foot, and was soon free. Crouched on the wood with his head cocked, he listened as footsteps from above us seemed to move towards the hatch, then thankfully moved away again. There was a moment in which I wondered if he might simply leave me there. After all, we were strangers. He owed me nothing. Why should he waste time and endanger his own bid for freedom by helping me? But in the next instant, after a moment's hesitation, perhaps he wondered himself about the wisdom of helping me, he scrambled over towards me, checked the shackles, then hurried over to an unseen section of the deck behind me, returning with keys. His name was Adewale, he told me, as he opened the shackles. I thanked him quietly, rubbing my ankles and whispering, "Now what's your plan, mate?" "Steal a ship," he said simply. I like the sound of that. First, though, I retrieved my robes and hidden blade, as well as adding a pair of leather braces and a leather jacket to my ensemble. Meanwhile, my new friend Adewale was using the keys to release the other prisoners. I snatched another set from a nail on the wall and joined him. "There's a catch to this favour," I told the first man I came to as my fingers worked at the key in his restraints. "You're sailing with me." "I'd follow you to hell for this, mate." Now there were more men standing on the deck and free of shackles than there were still restrained, and perhaps those above had heard something, because suddenly the hatch was flung open, and the first of the guards thundered down the steps with his sword drawn. "Hey," he said, but hey turned out to be his final word. I'd already fitted my hidden blade, and had a moment's reflection that, though I had only been wearing it for such a short space of time, it still felt somehow familiar to me, almost as though I'd been wearing it for years, and with a flick of my forearm had engaged the blade, then stepped forward and introduced the blade to the guard, driving it deep into his sternum. It wasn't exactly stealthy or subtle, and I stabbed him so hard that the blade punctured his back and pinned him to the steps until I wrenched him free. Now I saw the boots of a second soldier and the tip of his sword as reinforcements arrived, and for this one I didn't wait. Backhanded, I sliced the blade just below his knees, and he screamed and toppled, losing his sword, losing his balance, one of his lower legs cut to the bone and pumping blood to the deck as he joined his mate on the wood. By now it was a full-scale mutiny, and the freed men ran to the piles of confiscated goods and liberated their own gear, arming themselves with cutlasses and pistols, pulling boots on. I saw squabbles breaking out already over whose items were whose, but there was no time to play arbitrator. A clip around the ear was what it took, and then our new team was ready to go into action. Above us we heard the sound of rushing feet and panicked shouting in Spanish as the guards prepared themselves for the uprising. Just then, something else. The ship suddenly rocked by what I knew was a gust of wind. Across the deck I caught Adewale's eye, and he mouthed something to me. One word. Hurricane. Again it was as though the ship had been rammed as a second gust of wind hit us. Now time was against us. The battle needed to be won fast, and we had to take our own ship, because these winds, furious as they were nothing compared to the force of a full-scale hurricane. You could time its arrival by counting the delay between the first gusts. You could see the direction the hurricane was coming from. And if you were an experienced seaman, which I was by now, then you could use the hurricane to your advantage. So long as we set sail soon, we could outrun any pursuers. Yes, that was it. The terror of the hurricane had been replaced by the notion that we could make it work in our favour. Use the hurricane, outrun the Spanish. A few words in Adewale's ear, and my new friend nodded and began to spread news of the plan throughout the rest of the men. They would be expecting us out of the main hatch. They'd be expecting an uncoordinated, haphazard attack through the hatch of the quarterdeck. So let's make them pay for underestimating us.